Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some dark academia inspired book recommendations because I have recently been reading quite a few dark academia themed books and I have been thoroughly enjoying it. And had you asked me a few months ago, I would have told you that dark academia is probably not the aesthetic for me. It's not really the type of book that I would be interested in. But once I started reading a little bit more in this kind of subgenre, I took a look back at my favorites shelf on Goodreads, and I discovered that a lot of my favorite books over the years have actually been books that are termed dark academia. So I decided that I thought I would make a couple of videos around dark academia, so some books that I recommend that I have read, books that are on my TBR, but I am gonna split this into two. Today we're gonna talk about modern books. And in the next Dark Academia recommendations video, I will talk about classics that I consider dark academia. Now, there are plenty of places that you can go to get a good definition of what dark academia is. And for me, it kind of fluctuates. So I initially really thought something could only be termed dark academia if it took place at a school. And a book that I am currently reading has told me that that's not really the case. Now for me, dark academia is really all about the intensive search for knowledge. And so that can come in many different forms. It doesn't necessarily have to come in a boarding school or university setting, though I think that is where it shines. And so that's why a lot of people are really married to the idea of dark academia actually being in the realm of academia. There are various definitions. Some of them are very, very flexible. So really what you interpret as dark academia is very much up to you personally, I think. So that is just kind of my interpretation. I think a novel needs to revolve around the search for knowledge in some way, shape, or form. And I think that knowledge, reading, seeking, and learning really needs to be at the forefront of the story for it to be considered dark academia for me. If you're curious about the tea that I am drinking today, because I think you'll see it in frame, I am having some orange cinnamon tea. I'm not really sure if that's very much on trend for the dark academia kind of vibe or aesthetic, but that's what I'm having today. To kick us off, I would like to start with the book that I am currently reading, and then we will go into books that I have read that I recommend. And then at the end, there are going to be a few books that are still on my TBR that I'm looking forward to getting to very soon. But the book that I am currently reading that really inspired this video in truth is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And this is an Italian work, and I think it can basically be considered a modern classic because as you can see, this is published by Vintage. The edition that I own is published by Vintage, which is known for publishing classics. And so Umberto Eco has pretty much entered the echelons of a modern classic in my opinion, and certainly this book has. I've heard a lot about The Name of the Rose over the years. This book follows two monks who venture to a very mysterious monastery that's very secluded, but that has a very, very famous library. And when they get there, a series of murders occurs, and so this is essentially kind of a historical murder mystery. And when I say monks, when I say monastery or abbey, you might think on the surface that really doesn't sound very dark academic. And I would agree with you. I kind of picked this up on a whim. I've always thought that I would really, really enjoy it. But quite a bit of this book is very dark academic themed. It's very much focused on the pursuit of knowledge and on learning and how that can be, you know, very much at length from the average person. The average person maybe doesn't get to enter the echelons of this very elaborate library at this abbey. And I think this is something that dark academia also plays with, which is privilege. And so you may have the privilege to go to a certain private arts college and learn all about classics, but other people do not. And so there is an element of dark academia to me that views knowledge and certain types of knowledge as very, very rarefied or classified as the purview of a very small segment of people. It's not something that everyone gets to do. And I think there's something very interesting about that. I think there's something very off-putting about dark academia for a lot of people due to that reason. But I really like how dark academia looks at that issue and explores that issue. And so I'm going to read you a quote from The Name of the Rose. And our main character is kind of thinking about the fact that the library at this abbey is off limits even to most of the other monks. And he is wondering to himself why that is. And I think his conclusions are utterly brilliant. And I think this quote will probably sell you on the book as a whole. It is this beautifully written throughout. There, I said to myself, are the reasons for the silence and the darkness that surround the library. It is the preserve of learning, but can maintain this learning unsullied only if it prevents its reaching anyone at all, even the monks themselves. Learning is not like a coin, which remains physically whole even through the most infamous transactions. It is rather like a very handsome dress, which is worn out through use and ostentation. Is not a book like that, in fact. Its pages crumble, its ink and gold turn dull, if too many hands touch it. A couple of paragraphs down, he says that a monk had fixed the parchment to the desk, pricking the margins with tiny holes on both sides, between which, with a metal stylus, he was now drawing very fine horizontal lines. Soon the 2 pages would be filled with colors and shapes. The sheet would become a kind of reliquary, glowing with gems studded in what would then be the devout text of the writing. Those 2 brothers, I said to myself, are living their hours of paradise on earth. They were producing new books, just like those that time would inexorably destroy. I'm only halfway through, but I feel sure this is going to be 5 stars, and it is just absolutely beautifully written. What it has to say about classical knowledge and learning and the interaction of Christian religion with pagan texts at this time, because this is set in the medieval period. I don't know that I said that, but it is set in 1327. And so there's a lot of interesting conversation around monks preserving pagan literature. And whether or not they should do that based on their religious leanings. So this is just an absolutely fascinating book. This is a book that really makes you think. So we can't do a dark academics recommendation video without talking about the 2 giants of the field to me. So we're going to talk about the big one. And that's The Secret History, which I recently reread. And you might recall that towards the beginning of the year, one of my goals this year is to reread books. And I really wanted to reread books, not only that I loved and that I would like to return to again, but I wanted to reread books that I didn't like, that I had very controversial opinions about, let's say. And The Secret History was one of those. So a few years ago, I read The Secret History for the first time, and to say I hated it is an absolute understatement. And so I decided this past month it was time to commit to rereading it. And I am so glad I did, because I have been completely converted and I now absolutely love The Secret History. I rated it 5 stars this time around. Something about it this second time through really struck me, and I realized why I didn't like it the first time. And it's because so much of The Secret History is a personal call out to me. I believe that the first time I read this, I definitely did not want to see myself in these characters. But I'm a little bit older now, I'm a little bit more self-aware, and I'm willing to admit that there are aspects of the characters that I do kind of relate to. And so The Secret History is a book that I'm sure you've all heard of, but it is about a murder that happens at a small kind of liberal arts college up in Vermont, and they are a group of students who are in a very elite Greek club with a very particular professor, let's say. It's very thrilling, but there are parts of The Secret History that drag, that are very, very slow, and I think were why I struggled with it the first time through as well. But I'm gonna be honest with you about The Secret History. I think people think The Secret History is completely unbelievable, and nobody is this pretentious, nobody acts this way, this is not how classics departments are. Well, this is coming from a former classics student. I switched to history, but I was a classics student at one time. These people exist. These characters exist. You can walk into any classics department in the country, in the world, I'll say, in the world, and you will find a character that you think could be in the secret history. An element of the secret history that I think people either struggle with or they really, really love. And there's a reason why this book seems to be so divisive, and you either love it or hate it. But I think one of the things that people struggle with is the characters, because I think the characters are all designed to be fairly unlikable. And they are very, very pretentious. But they are a brand of pretentious that I understand, and I'm fully aware of it, and I'm willing to say that it's my brand of pretentious. There's so much about Dante in this book that felt like a personal call out to me. I mean, one time they're all stressed about the fact that this murder has happened, and one character is like, why don't you read Dante and you'll calm down a bit? Valid, I would say that. That's absolutely great advice. And I just felt like they were taking words out of my mouth and putting them on the page. I felt like Donna Tartt was coming for me. There were multiple other instances like that where the character said something and I thought, oh my gosh, I could have said that in undergrad. I could say it now. And so The Secret History, there is a reason why it is the true dark academia classic, and it is one that I recommend. But having now been on both sides of the divide, both loving and hating it, I understand if you can't get through it, if you had to DNF it, and I also understand if it's your new favorite book of all time. It's a very interesting book, and apparently it is one that has struck me differently at different periods of my life. The other giant of the dark academia subgenre, is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, and this also takes place at kind of a small liberal arts college with a group of students who are Shakespearean actors and who were very much into Shakespeare. Another murder occurs. This is very, very similar to The Secret History, and they are often talked about in conjunction with one another, and I think it's often talked about that if you like one, you probably don't like the other. And for a long time, I thought that must be true because I truly loved If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This also felt weirdly relatable to me because in undergrad, my minor was in late medieval Elizabethan Renaissance literature. And so I took quite a few Shakespeare courses. I actually took courses entirely devoted to Shakespeare, and then I took other courses entirely devoted to Elizabethan literature in general, where we always had to touch on Shakespeare. So it was very fun to me to read a book where I understood a lot of the references that they were making. This is a shorter book than The Secret History, and thus it feels a whole lot more pacey. It really is much quicker paced, and so I think that will really be the determining factor for a lot of people, whether or not you like The Secret History or If We Were Villains more. I do think, on the whole, If We Were Villains is still a tighter story than The Secret History, but the kind of classical medieval allusions that were taking place in The Secret History appeal to me and my academic side a little bit more than Shakespeare does at this point. But everyone loves Shakespeare, and that's why I think this is probably the best one to start with. I think this should be your gateway into dark academia. The next book that I want to talk about is a recent read of mine, and it is A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee. And this book was 5 stars, and so it is very, very much a high recommend from me. This book focuses on a small boarding school that also happens to be in the United States in the Northeast, which apparently is a very popular place to set a dark academic book. But this focuses on 2 characters. One is a girl whose girlfriend died under mysterious circumstances last year, and she may or may not have been involved in this girl's death. And then there is another main character, is a girl who has come to the school who is a very famous writer, and she has come to the school to do research on the history of the boarding school, which has to do with witches and ghosts and hauntings, because she wants to write her next book there. And of course, these 2 characters kind of converge together in a very, very interesting way. This book took turns that I really didn't see coming, but I think I probably should have. But this is a really interesting book because these 2 girls are situated in almost like a secret society or like a department within the school that focuses specifically on literature. And so a lot of the book is taken up with discussions of what their thesis is going to be, what their dissertation is going to be about. And our main character decides to talk about mental health and women, and how women are portrayed in horror fiction, and whether or not that's really disrespectful or not, especially because women and mental health in horror fiction historically has been a way to make you believe that the narrator is unreliable and thus adds to the thriller aspect of the story. Her dissertation and that idea becomes a major component of the novel itself. And so it is so interesting to see that the book examines the themes that it wants to play with overtly on the page. And so this is just fabulous. I read this in a single day. I could not put it down. It is beautifully written and it is so thrilling. I really didn't know where this was going. And looking back, I do think I should have. I think there were elements of this that have probably been done before and likely have been done better, I'll say that. But for me, everything about the book worked. Every element that it had worked extremely well, fell into place for me very, very well. And so this book was 5 stars. I really loved it. I want to go back and read everything that Victoria Lee has ever written because this was truly spectacular to me. I have been thinking about doing an individual review on this because it is so fascinating. I think this book took dark academia and went with it to a really interesting place. It took it in a kind of supernatural direction, which I really crave. There are elements of that to The Secret History, which I think is just fascinating. I really want to do an individual review on The Secret History as well, because I think both of these books examined things and themes in literature through the characters and yet also through the kind of classroom setting that the books were exploring in a university and a boarding school. So this was really fascinating. I also really appreciated that this book was sapphic. For me in the past, dark academia seems to focus a little bit too much on the male characters. Often it only follows male characters. So I was really excited to see a book that featured female characters and also a sapphic relationship. So this one was just amazing, 5 stars, highly recommend. Next, let's talk about a couple of my favorites of all time. One of these is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. And this follows a woman who discovers that she is a witch. She unearths a magical alchemical manuscript at Oxford. And so the story kicks off from there. Oxford plays a large role in this first book, and the university setting plays a large role. This series has really taken off because of the romance between the main character, Diana, and Matthew, who is a vampire. And I think Matthew's character is such a fascinating one because Diana is a scholar from the modern day. And so she spends a lot of her time analyzing history. And Matthew is a figure who has lived it. And so there is so much to dig into here. I actually think this first book is probably the weakest in the series, in my opinion, but it is the one that is the most dark academia. The second book in this trilogy is my favorite and is one of my favorite books of all time. I truly think, even if you struggle with this first book, give the second one a try because it is just such a phenomenal read. But I really love how this looks at academia through Diana's lens, through a magical lens, through a historical lens with Matthew. And it also analyzes kind of how academia covers things up in a very interesting way. So this is a series that I'm sure many of you have heard of, and I'm sure many of you have read. But if you haven't read it, I think this is a really wonderful one, and I definitely think it qualifies as dark academia. Another of my favorites of all time is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. And this book is about Dracula, and it is about whether or not Dracula is still alive in the semi-modern day. This takes place in a couple of different timelines, one being the 1950s and one being the 1970s that I remember. There might even have been one in the 1920s. And so it jumps around a bit, but this is truly such a fantastic book. I have only read it one time, and it's one that I really want to reread before the end of the year, because I view this book as being very influential on me and why I chose the career path that I chose. Because the title of the book, The Historian, could actually refer to any character in the book. Dracula himself is also a historian and a collector of knowledge, and one of the other characters is a librarian. And so much happens in libraries and universities, and this book really takes you on a bit of a whirlwind tour through Europe and through really interesting libraries and archives in Europe. And I believe that this book, you know, very much influenced why I decided to go into archiving. So this is one that I have a very visceral memory of reading. I read it when it first came out, I believe in 2005, and I was 12, 13 years old, and it was formative. I really love this book, not only because I view it as personally making an impact on me, but I also just love a vampire book. And the vampires in this are what you want them to be. I think vampires in general are very dark academia, and let me preface that by saying they should be dark academia, because now vampires can kind of be a little bit more monstrous or more lab created, but I think vampires in the truest sense should be old. They should be ancient. They should have experienced things that you can't fathom. They should have very long memories, and they should just really be all about age. I think that's what makes a vampire appealing to me above all else, is the thought that they've lived that long. And this book explores the fact that Dracula really has lived a very long time, but he has continued to learn, and he has continued to allow his kind of personal collection, his personal library, he has allowed that to grow. And so it is just absolutely fantastic. This is one of my favorites of all time, and it's probably my favorite on this list. So if you were looking for a single recommendation, pick up The Historian. Another book I've read and really enjoyed was Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, and I didn't love this just because Tracy Deonn is a local author. She's from North Carolina. This book is set at UNC Chapel Hill, and actually Victoria Lee, who wrote A Lesson in Vengeance, is also a local author, so this is really exciting. But this book also has to do with the Arthurian legend. It has to do with secret societies at UNC Chapel Hill, and it is so fascinating. You would wonder how she can marry the Arthurian legend with UNC Chapel Hill, with teenagers, because this is a YA book. It just doesn't seem like all of those elements should come together in a cohesive way, but they do, and it works really, really well. This book also interestingly explores privilege, like I talked about earlier, which I think is a fairly large theme in dark academia, but it explores how historically white institutions such as UNC Chapel Hill, how they view people of color, how they are still very elite, though they claim to be very open and diverse now, that it's still extremely hard for women, for people of color, for people of the LGBTQ community. It is very difficult for them to enter places of power in academia, or even within certain circles among students in academia. So our main character, Bree, who is sucked into this really fun supernatural world, she's dealing with really deep issues. I personally think this is a very reflective and very deep book, a very interesting look at academia. A lot of people have called this book very formulaic, and they've found it very tropey, but for me, I think the message of this book is so important, and I think it is very relatable to teenagers. This book feels very much like YA, truly written for its target audience. I think YA has gotten away from that in the recent years. I think YA authors now actually try to write for adults, and for people like myself who grew up when YA started happening and are viewed still as the target demographic for that, weirdly enough. But Legendborn does truly feel like a book that I would have devoured as a teen, and I would have really appreciated the discussions in. So this is one that I also highly recommend. Last but not least, let's talk about An Instance at the Fingerpost by Iain Pears. This is a weird one. This book is actually one that I have set down for the time being, and I'm not quite sure if I actually will return to it. It's very, very slow. This is also set at Oxford, but is set at Oxford during the 1660s. And so it is set in the period following the English Civil War. This also follows a murder mystery, which seems to be a pretty iconic plot for dark academia books. But I really think this was set up to do something different. It was set up in a very interesting way where you were supposed to get multiple different characters' point of view on one case. And so as you go through the book, you are supposed to start wondering about the previous narrators that you have read from. Can you really trust them? Should you have really trusted their version of events? And so I think the premise of the book was very, very interesting. It just took so long to get anywhere. And I am not all that familiar with the kind of post-Civil War England period, with the historical figures of that period, because I could tell a lot of names were being dropped and a lot of the characters in the book are actually historical figures. So I think had I known a little bit more about this period of time, I would have enjoyed it more. If this was set during the age of Richard III and everybody was a historical figure from the Wars of the Roses, I would have had no problem with it being slow because I would have just been happy to be there. So I think that was probably my issue with it. I do want to recommend it though, because I think this is a book that has a very particular audience, and I think certain people will really, really love it. And I may love it at a different time, but I think I'm just going to put it down for the time being. This has turned out to be a much longer video than I intended, so let's talk quickly through the books that I have on my TBR currently. So one of the books on my TBR is the Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake, I believe, or Olivie Blake, I'm not quite sure. This is one that has taken Twitter by storm. I see people tweeting about this book all the time. I see it all over Bookstagram. And this is one that I think is about people who are keeping the Library of Alexandria together. We in kind of the public sphere believe that the Library of Alexandria burned down, but actually it is being preserved by a group of librarians, and I think the Atlas 6 follows that group of librarians. So I'm not quite sure if this is a real fantasy book, if there are real fantastical elements to it, but a lot of people have really loved it, and a lot of people have categorized it as dark academia. I also have The Maidens by Alex Michaelides, which was very, very high on my TBR when it first came out. But since it came out, I have heard so many terrible negative reviews of this book that I'm really no longer excited about it. I'm actually dreading reading it. So this is one that I hope that my expectations are actually so low for that I really, really enjoy it. So you never know. This might wind up being a new favorite of mine. We'll see. But this is also about kind of a secret society, I believe this time at Cambridge and not Oxford, which will be unique. I've not visited Cambridge fictionally, so this is going to be a fun one. I really hope that I have a different experience to it than most people seem to be having. I also currently have out from the library Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth, and this is a dual timeline narrative that I think is also taking place at a prestigious boarding school in the Northeast somewhere. But I believe something happened in the early 1900s when the school was being founded, and in the modern timeline, a film is actually being created around those events. And so students are being cast in this film, I believe. I have heard mixed things about this one. A lot of people actually think this is really scary. So I'm looking forward to seeing how I feel about this. It is massive. It's absolutely huge, and since I have it out from the library, I really should get started on it soon before my checkout date comes in. But this is a super, super long book, and that is one thing I'll say for it. I have heard a lot of people say it doesn't need to be this length, so I'll be interested to see how I feel about this. I feel very good about it. I think I'm probably really going to enjoy this. Last but not least is The Likeness by Tana French. And I really just want to read the Dublin Murder Squad books in general because I think I'm going to love them because I loved the show so, so much. If I am going to read a mystery, it might as well be something like that. Because the weird thing to me is everything about the show, and thus everything about this book series, feels as though it could have been done by fairies. I don't know if I'm just associating Ireland and folk tales here, but there is a real element of not knowing what's happening and no explanation for certain things. So The Likeness is actually the second book in the series, I believe, and you can read these in any order. I kind of want to read them in the order that they were published. But this focuses on a detective who goes into a group of students. She goes undercover into a group of students after a girl who looks just like her is murdered. And so she goes in assuming this woman's identity. And why does this woman look like her? Why does she have a doppelganger? I don't know. I personally would say fairies, but I don't know that that's really how it goes, and I just always want the answer to be fairies and everything, but I'm really excited about this. Apparently the dark academic vibes here are immaculate. So this is a series I'm really excited about starting. So those are all of the modern books that I would recommend that are dark academia themed. Hopefully soon I will have another video all about the classics that I love, that I think are dark academia themed. But I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, and I would also love to know what you recommend in terms of dark academia books. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.